We want to see an approach to fighting the climate crisis where it doesn't put the burden on the backs of working people, where big polluters have to pay their fair share, they have to pay the price of their pollution, but it shouldn't be on working people's shoulders. And so we've been working on a plan, and we'll be releasing our plan, our vision for how we can do that in a stronger way in the coming months.
Would the plan include a consumer carbon tax?
We'll let you know when the plan is ready, and we'll let you know more details about it.
Days before returning to Ottawa, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, as you saw there, is facing fresh questioning on his stance on the federal price on pollution, still refusing to say if the NDP's own climate plan will include a consumer carbon price, setting up a hot debate in the House of Commons now that he's torn up his deal to support Justin Trudeau's minority government. Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault was quick to jump on Singh's comments. Have a look.
Through leadership is often shown when the going gets tough. The reason I came into politics is to fight climate change, which is why I was so disappointed to see Jagmeet Singh's NDP cave to Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative misinformation and disinformation campaign on carbon pricing. Putting a price on pollution is the best way to reduce emissions. Jagmeet Singh and the NDP know that more than 200 economists have said that it was the best measure that we can put in place to fight climate change.
So what do Singh's comments and the reaction to them tell us about next week's return to Parliament and the big by-elections that take place the same night? Let's bring in our front bench to talk about that. Former BC Premier Christy Clark is here. She's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. Former Alberta MLA and Cabinet Minister Gary Marr is with us. He's the president and CEO of the Canada West Foundation, and former Manitoba Premier and Canadian Ambassador to the U.S., Gary Duer. He's now a senior business advisor at Dentons. Hi, everybody. Very nice to see you. Gary Marr, I got to figure out a way to say this every week now without your full.
So you can be even harder for you.
Yeah, exactly. No kidding. Gary. Mr. Marr, I'll start with you and just ask you, look, this sort of lack of an answer around the consumer side of the carbon tax is not new when it comes to the NDP. I remember months ago doing interviews with Mr. Singh, seeking more clarity on the position. But I think what is new is the context, the backdrop against which he made those comments today and was asked those questions, right? The possibility of the Conservatives on an Opposition Day motion putting forward a question of confidence on the carbon tax and all the politics that kind of surround the fact that that deal with the Liberals doesn't exist anymore. Do you think that's why this has gotten such a reaction from opposition parties?
I mean, he's trying to distance himself. Mr. Singh is trying to distance himself from the Liberal Party. And, he's seen, for example, the NDP provincial party here in Alberta sort of campaign on getting rid of the consumer carbon tax. This is a wildly unpopular tax. And so it's no surprise that, now that his confidence agreement with the Liberal Party has ended, that they would try and distance themselves from the Liberals, while at the same time, he's got a difficult job because, he doesn't want to exactly endorse the Conservative position either. And unless he works on this carefully, he could sort of create a schism among those party members of the NDP that are environment supporters. And so Mr. Singh has got a very difficult position to carry himself through, but it's quite clear, as Gary Duer said last week, it's not a very good campaign strategy to have a motto that says, vote for my party because, we support the other party. That was what caused the end of the confidence and supply agreement. And I think that this actually makes sense for Mr. Singh so that he can actually focus on the things that his party thinks are important.
Do you think, Gary, it makes sense for him to take this position?
Well, I think it made sense for him to take this position when the Liberals exempted all of Atlantic Canada, and the rest of us had the attitude of, what do we, chop liver, as they would say in North Winnipeg. The bottom line was we have a 97% renewable energy grid paid for by the ratepayers in our province, and then we're treated in a way that adds the carbon tax. I think in terms of the politics of this, his statement on the carbon tax is not peaking too early in Winnipeg Transcona. Let me assure you that, again, with the clean energy we already have. And secondly, I was a bit surprised he announced it today in Montreal, given I think the Liberals will be very happy in a very competitive by-election race on September 16th that the leader of the NDP made this statement in downtown Montreal. I was surprised at that. The discussion on the carbon tax, I thought, should have started with the exemption for some Canadians as opposed to the rest of us.
And he did and has in the past, Christy, to be fair to Mr. Singh, sort of grounded his argument in that. Like, that's when he started to really try and get some distance with the Liberals. But he hasn't filled in the gaps, so they're a vacuum in the interim, right? And so then I think, 6 months later, when he says the same thing he sort of did 6 months ago, but against the backdrop of the Conservatives really pushing for this quote-unquote carbon tax election, it kind of takes on a new meaning politically.
It does. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, that's for Christy, the non-Gary.
Okay, we're finished with the Garys. Okay.
Okay, you can call me Gary. The problem he's got, ultimately, I think, is that he has supported this government in what they've been doing in the carbon tax for the better part of a decade now. And now, in the midst of a by-election and a federal election coming up within a year, or almost a little more than a year, he's now suddenly changing his position. So I think what he's going to get from this, rather than what he hopes to get, is kind of a reputation as sort of being untrustworthy or playing easy politics. And I don't think he comes across.
Oh, we're missing Christy's last
Well,
part of that point. Sorry, Christy, I think you have to repeat it. You totally froze.
I would say I think he comes across as unprincipled. And I would say for the NDP, that's a tough thing because, lots of us don't agree with NDP policies on stuff. But honestly, many people would say, well, at least they've got principles. Well, apparently, Jagmeet Singh doesn't have a whole lot of principles, and he'll change them at the, when the winds start blowing in a different direction. And I think that's the big downside in this for him. I would also say you better watch your back when New Democrats decide they're going to play with the carbon tax, because Gordon Campbell brought one in British Columbia. It worked. When the NDP and BC came in, the first thing that they did is they took every penny of revenue from the carbon tax, which had previously gone into big tax cuts for people in the province, and they put it in straight to government coffers. They kept raising it after we'd frozen it, and they grew government by 50%, but largely by virtue of the fact that they were taking the carbon tax out of people's pockets and putting it into the government's pocket.
Well, we'll wait to see the specifics, which apparently are coming soon, in both the Conservatives and the NDP's plan. Gary Mar, Christy references the wins there of change. And just tying into what Gary Dewar said, I think some of it has to do with the Winnipeg by-election, actually. And I think, at the expense of the Montreal one, perhaps, as Gary Dewar pointed out, this doesn't feel like an issue in Manitoba that means nothing to people at the doors.
Well, I think there are winds of change, and they're blowing hard. And Christy was talking about the number of times that the NDP had voted in favor of of a carbon tax. I did some quick counting, and going back to March of 2017 to June of 2024, on no less than 20 occasions did I find that the NDP, in fact, voted in favor of a carbon tax. And so now, to Christy's point, as they've had a change of heart as to whether this is the right thing to do. As a principle, I'd go back to what Jack Layton said, and he said, "Look, we live in a cold climate, and putting a carbon tax, on the way that we heat our homes is not consistent with what the NDP party stood for at that time." I think Jagmeet Singh is finally returning to that position, but it's hard to do after he's voted for, in favor of a carbon tax. For the last 7 years, as Christy points out.
Yeah, the only caveat, Gary Mar is right, there were a lot of instances in which he voted against what the Conservatives had put forward, but there were some, particularly in and around the exemption provided to Atlantic Canada, when he did side, just on a few occasions, with the Conservatives, particularly in that context. Gary Dewar, how much of this do you think has to do with that by-election? I mean, Wab Kinew, for example, the Premier of Manitoba, an NDPer, very specifically not in favor of the again, we're talking about not the industrial side, but the consumer side of the carbon tax.
Well, that's right. And of course, in Manitoba, he's very proud of being premier of a province that has a grid that's 97% clean energy, electricity grid, and a grid that actually sells power to Minnesota in exchange for wind power coming up on the grid for hydro. So when you're really representing a province like Manitoba, people have already paid for clean energy and climate change action in their utility bills. So it's kind of a double whammy for consumers. And I'm sure it's not popular in Winnipeg, Transcona. But on the other side, and the Liberal, the tie with the Liberals that we talked about last week is also not very popular. As I pointed out, you can't vote for me and I'll vote for the other guy. That doesn't work. Still doesn't work this week. And but you know, they are the incumbent party. They may win the seat. They actually could win two, Montreal, and hold the incumbent seat in Transcona. But they also could lose two. And of course, for the Prime Minister, he's all in on the one seat. It will have the kind of reverberation that Toronto St. Paul had if they lose that by-election in Montreal. So it's a very important day. It's not just the opening of Parliament, but it's counting real ballots as opposed to making comments on polling and projections that way.
Yeah. Yeah, when they say that the only poll that counts is election day, that will actually be Monday. Christy, yes. We've been talking about the NDP, but I'll give the last comment to you on those by-elections, particularly in that Montreal one. Do you see it as an inflection point? I mean, everyone thought Toronto St. Paul's was an inflection point given how safe that seat was for the Liberals. Is this the equivalent of that or something more, particularly where the Prime Minister's leadership is concerned?
Well, I think losing this one for the Liberals would be an even bigger kick in the gut for sure. The one at St. Paul's was a terrible wake up call for them. But you know, I look at it and I think, well, nothing happened after St. Paul. Perhaps I mean we can't be guaranteed that anything is going to change in the party after La Salle est Mare if Mr. Trudeau doesn't win. But I do think that the Liberals still have a very, very good chance there. I think that the odds are with them. It's a very, very good riding for the Liberals historically. But you know, one never knows how it will turn out. And again, in every case, I think the media guessed wrong about St. Paul's, that it wasn't an inflection point. So I presume we can't know the answer to that now either.